Children, you can be dismissed this morning to Children's Church. Psalm, the 33rd Psalm, the 12th verse says, "How blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." How blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. King Solomon writes, and he says, "Righteousness exalts a nation." I want to give you three statements here. Let's just suppose this week that you turned on the TV and you heard these statements. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has just issued this statement. Divine providence, God, has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. Now, the Justice of the Supreme Court says this. What would you think about? Or what would they say in our country today if this were on by the reporters? Inquiries by our reporters reveal that almost every state legislator has now passed a law requiring that all elected officials take an oath of office in which they profess God as Father and Christ as His Son and acknowledge the power of the Bible. Or how about this one? Legislation was passed today in Congress to affirm that Congress of the United States approves and recommends that the Holy Bible be used in all schools and paid for by taxes of the government. You know as well as I do, if these were announced today in our news media, you know what kind of reaction we would have today. There would probably be riots in the streets. We cannot even begin to realize the reaction of these statements if they came across the airwaves today. However, each one of these statements are historically accurate and they're factual. None of this was made up. Each of these are actual statements. John Jay, the first Chief Justice and one of the primary writers of the Constitution, said that it was the duty of Americans to elect Christian rulers. The Supreme Court Chief Justice. It was the state of Delaware, along with others, that required that everybody in the state who had the job confirm their belief in Christianity. And in 1782, Congress approved the Bible for all schools and paid for those Bibles out of tax dollars. Now, you know as well as I do, if that were to happen in our country today, if we were to ask Congress to declare the Bible as primary in school and pay for it in tax dollars, what kind of reaction would we have in this country today? All of us would be considered radical right-wingers, and we would be considered intolerant fanatics, wouldn't we? Today, so much of our history and our spiritual roots has been debunked and it's been neglected. We're living in a day, in an age in which society is trying to deconstruct our history, deconstruct where we have come from. We must never forget that we came from a nation, and we need to hear it over and over again, where our country came from. Our children need to hear it. It needs to be taught in our secular schools. We need to be reminded every day that America is a blessed nation, and it was founded on this principle: in God we trust. That was the principle that our nation was founded upon. No matter how much they try to look back in history and debunk and deconstruct and change history, you cannot change history. And our country was founded on that principle: in God we trust. So I want to preach this morning about some things I believe that are worth knowing about the roots of our nation and what's right about our country. Three things. First of all, America was settled by people that were looking for religious freedom. If you study the books, and you have studied them in school, America was founded by people who were looking for religious freedom. The first thing that is right about our country is that the earliest settlers of our country, they came here looking for religious freedom. The Pilgrims were ostracized from England, and they came to our shores looking for a place to worship God and a place to read the Bible and a place for freedom. Think about it. Many other nations are established and founded on selfish ambition and on power. Think about how other nations are founded. Australia, do you know how Australia was founded? Australia was founded as a prison colony. As a prison colony. Other nations were founded by selfish ambition and by other aspects of power. But the early settlers came to America looking for God. That's why they came to our country, looking for God. America was settled in the atmosphere of prayer. America was settled in the atmosphere of God. People came to America not looking for power, but they came to America looking for prayer. Contrast the Spanish. Look at the Spanish. When they came to the New World, what did the Spanish do? What did they do in the southern United States? What did they do in Mexico? They killed and they plundered. And the Spanish came to this continent looking for gold. You find it over and over. The Spanish came to this continent looking for gold, but the English came to this country looking for God. Our country was established by people who were looking for God. Their goal was God. Their goal was not gold. Their goal was to have God and to have the freedom to worship God the way that they wanted. The hardy souls of the Mayflower Compact in 1620, they fled from tyranny and oppression in England, and we know that. Before they settled and established a town in the New World, they wrote the Mayflower Compact. And they proclaimed in the Mayflower Compact these words. They said, "We came to the New World for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith." That's why they came, and that's why they settled. And that's what was written in the Mayflower Compact. In the early colonies, the first public building that was built, anytime they had a settlement, the first public building that was built was not a courthouse. It was not a jail. It was not a saloon. It was not a honky-tonk. But the first public building that they built in any kind of city was a church. And their first act was to publicly worship God. The church was the center of the community. The bells tolled and called the community to worship. The sanctuary was where they met to educate their children. And for security in times of trouble, that's where they came. In times of prosperity, they met there and they gave thanksgiving to God. And when they died, they wanted to be buried in the church ground and have their graves close to the church. The church held the community together, and usually the local parson was usually the most educated man in the village. In 1643, more and more people came to America, and they joined together to form what was called the New England Confederation. The New England Confederation was the first constitution written in the New World. The first constitution written in the New World. And it began with these words, "Whereas we all come into these parts with one and the same end and aim, namely to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ and to enjoy the liberties of the gospel in purity and in peace." That was written in the first ever constitution of our country. No matter how the modern media, the governmental people, and the educational systems try to debunk it, try to deconstruct it, and try to turn it away from the way it really was, the fact is America was founded by our spiritual forefathers who came to these shores to worship and practice their faith without fear of persecution. What would happen if teachers in our school system, or if I were to stand up and I say that Columbus came to America and his ships were not the Ninta, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria? That wasn't Columbus's ships, really. Columbus's ships were Eenie, Meenie, Miny, and Mo. That was the name of his ships. If I were to teach that, if teachers were to teach that, if we were to proclaim that as the truth, people would think that we were absolutely crazy. But it is the same thing. Our history shows that our nation was founded by God, and you cannot deconstruct that. You cannot change that. It is the truth. Our nation was founded by men and women who came here looking for religious freedom. It's recorded. It's in the books. And no matter how much you try to say, well, it really didn't happen, or they try to teach it differently in school, the truth is, that's the truth. Secondly, our founders had a strong desire to please God and to do His will. We have to understand that when the settlers came to America, America did not become a spiritual utopia. There was a period of about 150 years from the early settlers of that New England Confederation to the American Revolution. And in that time, some things happened in America that was not pleasing to God. You had the forced removal of the Indians. You had the introduction of slavery in the South. You had the Salem witch trials. And you had the greedy expansion to western lands. America, after it was settled, seemed to be turning more to gold than to God. Then God did a great thing for this country. He continued to bless America, and He began to raise up great pulpiteers. He began to raise up great preachers from the pulpit. And these preachers began to call America back to God. Preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, Gilbert Tennant and John Wesley, and many, many more. They would preach in the churches. They would preach in streets. They would preach in fields. They would preach anywhere they could get an audience. Soon these turned into great crusades, and revival began to spread throughout the 13 colonies of America. It was said that Jonathan Edwards was such a great preacher that he had this sermon called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And whenever he would preach that sermon, the power of the Spirit would be so great in the congregation that people would grab their pews and people would grab the post of the church crying because they were afraid they were slipping into hell. That was the power of that kind of preaching. So many came to Christ during that period that it was known as the Great Awakening. Tens of thousands of people became Christians and were baptized. So many came to hear George Whitefield that he couldn't meet in a building. They had to meet outside in open spaces. And Benjamin Franklin was so impressed by Whitefield's preaching that he helped build a 30,000-seat auditorium in Philadelphia just so that the crowd speak could be accommodated. It was a great revival. The Great Awakening was a great revival that swept America. Why was this great revival so important? The Great Awakening was the precursor to the American Revolution. Our founding fathers, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, those who wrote our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, those who gave their lives and put their lives on the line, those who fought and died that we might be free, they all grew up and came into leadership during that great revival. These men who we read about today, they came into leadership during the Great Awakening that was engulfing the land. The generation that experienced the Great Awakening became the leaders of the American Revolution. The leaders of the American Revolution came out of revival. Isn't that a wonderful thing to think about today in our country? We see this as a blessing from God. Out of revival, there came a commitment to God and the rights of human beings. A great revival was what birthed the American Revolution. The University of Houston did this. Over a 10-year period, political scientists got together. And they cataloged and collected 15,000 writings by the founding fathers. The University of Houston did this. Their goal was to determine the primary source and the primary idea behind the Constitution, and they wanted to identify that from their quotes and from their writing. Guess what the primary source was? They found the primary source of the Founding Fathers was the Bible. They found 94% of the quotes of the founders of our nation were based on the Bible. People today must realize that this cultural environment on the eve of the American Revolution was undeniably spiritual. This focus dramatically affected the men and the women who gave birth to this nation. Listen, most of the values that we have today and most of the institutions that we love and that we cherish, they were birthed during this time of our founding fathers. How blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. A third thing, America was founded by men and women who acknowledged God's supreme rule over men and nations. I've taken time over the years to read the biographies of many writings of the Founding Fathers. And I've always been impressed as I've read those writings, and you can read those writings too, how they recognized providence and how they believed they were being led by the hand of God. Many of them were devout Christians, and they saw their work of independence as something coming directly from the hand of God. Now, not all of the Founding Fathers were believers. We don't need to get the idea that they were all saints with halos around their heads. We need to understand it. Thomas Jefferson didn't like the miracles of Jesus. So he took his New Testament and he took out all of the miracles of Jesus. And he composed his own New Testament. I saw that New Testament the other day at McKay's bookstore, and it's about that thick. But the thing about it, Thomas Jefferson and any of these people, they were not against the Judeo-Christian ethic. They weren't against it, but they may not have been Christians. All of the believers, all of them weren't Christians. However, many of the early settlers or the early leaders were followers of Christ. Take, for instance, George Washington. This is what George Washington said, and this is a quote. "It is impossible to rightly govern a nation without God and the Bible." Research has shown that in Washington's speeches, he used God, the name of God, 147 times. In his speeches, he referred to the divine 95 times. In his speeches, he referred to heaven 133 times. In his speeches, he referred to providence 270 times. And in his speeches, he referred to the Bible 200 times. And in his lifetime, George Washington wrote over 100 prayers. You can't change history. That's the way it was, and that's the way we need to understand it. There was a part about the beginning of the Revolutionary War that I think is a wonderful story, and I want to relate it here just for a second. In the beginning of the Revolutionary War, George Washington wasn't a very good general. And the Revolutionary War soldiers, the Continental Army they weren't the soldiers that have the expertise like they have today in Afghanistan. And Washington led his army on to Long Island, and the British came, and Washington and the Continental Army were trapped by the East River in New York behind them, and General Howe's army of the British in front of them. They were sitting ducks. Sitting ducks. All Howe had to do was to attack. And instead of singing today, "God Bless America," we would be singing "Hail to the Queen," and we'd be having a spot of tea this afternoon. If Howe would have attacked, it would have been over with. However, Howe delayed his attack for some reason. And he didn't wipe out Washington's army. And he said, we'll do it in the morning. The next morning, a heavy fog came in on Long Island. Howe couldn't see his hand in front of him. When the fog cleared, Washington and his army were gone. They had found boats, logs, rafts, or whatever, and they had slipped across the East River to fight again. You know the rest of the story. Was it a coincidence that that fog rolled in that morning when Washington's army was going to be wiped out? No. I don't believe it was coincidence. I believe it was the hand of God. It was reported by John Adams at one point of the Continental Congress that they were discussing and debating the Declaration of Independence, and one of them suggested that they all get down on their knees and ask God what should be done. Adams later wrote his wife Abigail, and he said that even the Quakers were on their knees and they were crying. What would it be like today if we could see on the steps of Washington or in the White House, we could see our leaders on their knees asking God for His guidance and His direction for our country? As they finished approving the Declaration of Independence, they finished with these words, "And for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." 52 members of the 55 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Orthodox Christians. These men, as they worked to forge a nation, they knew that God was directing them. I believe that America was directed and protected by God, and I believe that we must realize this. We have to understand this. The Americans, they were just a ragtag bunch of farmers. They were tradesmen, they were businessmen who took on the world's greatest superpower of the time. Britain had the largest army. It had the largest army in the world. Britain had the largest navy in the world. Britain had more guns, more money, more men than any nation to fight, and they were challenged by these 13 little colonies who just wanted to be left alone and to worship God as they pleased. They established a nation and a government that was built on biblical principles and a government that guaranteed religious freedom. How blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Now you may be saying today, Pastor Lee, if you're awake, you may be saying this, Pastor Lee, this is more of a history lesson than a sermon. And you're probably right. However, we need to hear these things. We need to hear these things. We need to pause and remember and retell these stories. If we do not hear these stories from the pulpit, you will not hear them from your government. You will not hear them in the schools. You will not hear it in the media. We need to tell our children over and over. Our children need to hear these stories. They need to hear that we are living in the greatest country on earth. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to travel outside of this country. I've had a small opportunity here and there. And every time I've been outside of this country, I'm glad to get back to the United States of America. I don't like to be away from my zip code. Listen, this is the greatest country in the world. And it was given to us by men and women who felt like they were instruments in the hand of God to establish a country that would be a lighthouse for freedom for all time. May the dream of the patriots live forever. Okay, what are we to do with this morning? What are we to do with these stories and these facts that are history? People try to debunk them and people try to change them, but what are we to do with this? I think two things. Number one, I think we should be willing to pray for our leaders. And I think we need to be the best citizens that we can be. When was the last time you voted? When was the last time you participated in the democratic process? We need to pray for our leaders regardless of party, regardless of politics. And we need to be the best citizens that we can be. Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar. Paul said in Romans 13:1, he says, render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to custom, fear to fear, and honor to honor. 1 Peter 2:17 says, fear God and honor the king. That's our responsibility as citizens today, so that we can continue to have a nation in which we can worship and live in freedom. I'll close with this. The tallest structure in Washington, D.C., as you know, is the Washington Monument. And there's a law in Washington that nothing can be higher than the Washington Monument. There will never be anything in Washington higher than the Washington Monument. The pinnacle of the Washington Monument is the highest point in Washington, D.C. A lot of people don't know this, but inscribed on the pinnacle, the very top of the Washington Monument, are some Latin words. Some Latin words. The highest point, the highest pinnacle in Washington, D.C. are these words in Latin. Let God be praised. Let God be praised. Amen. Let's bow our heads this morning. As Mark plays meditatively this morning, here's how we need to respond to our message today. Take a moment this morning